but I had to tell him the effect, the powerful effect that he had on a nation and on people, his people. And when I received this letter, I never believed I would hear from him or receive a letter, because I knew he was in hiding, and I knew people wanted to do away with him, and I never thought I would hear from him. And this is what he wrote. I was deeply touched by your letter and want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your warm words and thoughts. Like you, I too believe that the day is getting closer when the good Lord will do justice to the Romanian people. And I, like you, I strongly believe that all of us who care about that once marvelous corner of the world should do something to help him. I can probably understand more easily than other Americans your feeling that people living in freedom often take freedom for granted, like the air they breathe. Red Horizons tries to open a window for the American reader looking out on the incredible life at the court of any Soviet bloc leader. I have dedicated it to all political prisoners, kept hostage against their will, who are crying for help from the free world. Once again, I want to say that I was deeply moved by your letter, as well as by your strong belief in freedom. Thank you for taking the trouble of sharing your feelings with me, even without knowing if your letter would ever reach me. With kindest regards, Ion Mihai Pacipa.
This day will mark a new start for a man who has lived his life in the darkness of the Iron Curtain. He is a communist spy master who will, this day, come out of the cold.
That morning, as I looked out into the sun, I wondered again if I could actually go through with it. For some reason, it seemed brighter that day. As head of the Romanian espionage service, I knew my knowledge would be a valuable asset to the West, but it would also make me a highly wanted man by my Soviet masters. As I got closer to the U.S. Embassy, I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. My mouth felt as if I had been freeze-dried. I knew that once I stepped through that door, there would be no going back. I would never again be able to return to the family, to the friends, or to the country I loved. But the darkness I had lived with for so long was eating away at my soul. I knew I must jump off this cliff, and I prayed I would land alive. Yet I still wondered, could I make this leap of faith?
Despite fear and deep reservations, Lieutenant General Ion Mihai Pacepa stepped into the U.S. Embassy and requested asylum. The CIA officer on duty was quick to understand the ramifications of such a defection. Under the cloak of night and high security, the highest-ranking Soviet bloc official ever to defect to the West was secretly whisked out of Germany. Although the price he paid for defecting was high, with a $2 million bounty on his head, multiple assassination attempts on his life, and is still hiding to this day, Lieutenant General Ion Mihai Pacepa is now speaking out. This is the true story of one man and the truth he revealed to the free world. The truth of a highly secret strategy called disinformation, an insidious formula to undermine and destroy Western civilization, a strategy still at work today. Prepare yourself for an eye-opening revelation as we unravel the world of disinformation.
Disinformation is the kernel of truth around which you weave a tissue of falsehoods.
And that twist with the lie is disinformation.
People have manipulated. The media is manipulating and manipulating.
This informer has no respect for means.
Disinformation has a very long-term strategic objective.
An influence campaign to influence American attitudes, to influence public opinion.
Disinformation appears to come from a trusted source.
A lie by the government.
Disinformation flows from the delusion
that you can change the world. Very sinister.
The disinformation has been going on for years and years.
If you can get the New York Times to release your misinformation, it becomes disinformation.
It's deceptive, it's disgusting, it's despicable, and it's part of their political program.
It's part of an overall strategy.
We see disinformation as a way to sidestep us, particularly in the intelligence world.
Disinformation has been part of the art of war going back to ancient times.
Disinformation is pervasive. It's pervasive in our society and in our culture.
It's a form of psychological warfare.
Born in Bucharest, Romania in the fall of 1928, Ion Mihai Pacepa grew up an only child of two rather different but loving parents. His devoted father was a workaholic who carved out a career repairing cars. Though he put no belief in God, he had a strong ethical knowledge of right and wrong and instilled that in his son. Mihai's mother loved her husband, and as a woman of faith, she prayed for him daily. Her moral worldview in a right and just Christian God was ingrained in her son from an early age, a seed of compassion that would someday bear fruit. The young Pacepa also learned a love for music and art, and at the age of 9, he could play Beethoven's difficult Kreutzer Sonata on his violin.
Pacepa was the highest-ranking defector of the Cold War then and still.
He's a remarkable man. That is one of the great acting jobs in human history, to have already begun decades before your internal migration away from the belief system of Romanian Communist Party, and to carry on with your job in such a way as to acquire a great deal of information that was useful to the West, and it was very useful. He was the most senior intelligence defector that we had during the Cold War as a head of Romanian intelligence. And for years before that, he was very senior and was in a lot of the meetings at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. So he's a fascinating individual and a brave man.
Witnesses like General Pacepa are very important to our defense of ourselves.
My father's lifelong dream had been to go to America. He spent most of his career working at the Bucharest affiliate of General Motors, and he was firmly determined that one day he would gather up his family and immigrate to Detroit. Trapped by the war and then by the Soviet occupation, he was forced to give up that dream, but not before passing his love for America along to me. The moment that the United States reopened its embassy after the war, I became one of its enthusiastic visitors. I didn't realize that it would be 33 years before I would fulfill my father's dream.
Pacepa was born into a world on the brink of disaster and tremendous upheaval. In the impoverished country of Germany, a charismatic leader and his nationalist party were gaining power. And in Russia, a man who would become the greatest mass murderer in history was solidifying his iron rule. The war to end all wars had ushered in the age of totalitarianism and would bring about the most heinous genocides of modern history. As a boy, Mihai knew nothing of the growing cancer called communism that would someday consume his world and nearly destroy his life. Communism had been born in the mind of Karl Marx, and in 1917, it became a nightmare on earth in Russia. The release in 1848 of the Communist Manifesto, the most famous pamphlet in the history of the world, would usher in a new religion, a religion based on man as God and government as deliverer.
These great or terrible messianic movements, Nazism, communism, socialism, all appear after Darwin. They appear when organized religion declines. People need a meaning in their lives, and these are substitutes for religion. And what makes them so dangerous, because they believe they can establish the kingdom of heaven in this world. And they will do anything that it takes to achieve that. And of course, if you believe that you lead mankind into the Garden of Eden, what crime wouldn't you commit and what lie wouldn't you tell to do it? And if you don't go along with the program, we're going to put you in a gulag, or we're going to put you up against a wall and shoot you. And that's the morality of the left, that there's nothing more dangerous than people who think they're God.
The communist doctrine, put to use by Vladimir Lenin, was taken to a new level of terror and fraud by Joseph Stalin. The result, an international ideology that snuffed out the lives of over 150 million people in the 20th century, twice the combined death toll of the two world wars. Vladimir Lenin infamously stated that the only morality that his Bolsheviks recognized was that which furthered their interests. This meant that lying was fully justified and that any target was legitimate. Russia became the first major power to make deception a permanent national policy. That deception included propaganda and the uniquely Soviet tactic of disinformation. But how is disinformation different and so much more insidious than other forms of political deception? Disinformation is a lie spread not by the liar, but by another source, by a legitimate source that many believe in. This makes it not only harder to discern, but can give it an often endless life of its own. The lie thus becomes a rewritten history. For example, if during the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union put out a story that American soldiers were carrying out atrocities reminiscent of Genghis Khan, the free world would recognize that as misinformation or propaganda. But if a U.S. soldier were to spread that and a newspaper carry it, then many citizens might believe the slander and question America's involvement. Since World War II, disinformation has been the Kremlin's most effective secret weapon in its war on the West. Stalin turned the practice into a science deeply rooted in Russia's soil and history. Born in the 18th century, disinformation was the fruit of the passionate love affair between Catherine the Great and Prince Potemkin, her principal political and military advisor. In 1787, Potemkin took the Empress on a tour of the Crimea, which he had been instrumental in annexing from the Turks. In order to impress her, Potemkin had arranged for fake villages to be erected along the route that Catherine would take. Down through the ages, everyone who has sat on the Kremlin throne has utilized disinformation to transform his country into a monument to himself. Controlling all expressions of religion was central to that ambition. This manipulation of religion dates back to the 16th century, when Ivan the Terrible had himself crowned as Russia's first Tsar, as well as head of the Russian Orthodox Church. Russia's manipulation and persecution of religion came to an apex with the creation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, perhaps the most resilient piece of disinformation ever compiled.
This book purports to be the words of psychopathic Jewish world leaders that are conspiring to enslave the entire world.
The Tsarists, who were anti-Semites to a fault, engineered the fabrication of a document they called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion for the purpose of sustaining one of the grounds for hating the Jews and engaging in pogroms against them, namely that they ran the world. And it is an extraordinary piece of work, not only because of the use that the Tsarists and those in Russia made of it, but the application of it to this very day by people who continue to find it useful for discrediting or undermining or justifying assaults against the Jews.
Judaism gave us the rule of law, comes out of the Sinai, and it's one of the reasons I think that anti-Semitism is always one of the first refuges of the scoundrels. They need to undermine that idea that the law is above the ruler. And one way they do that is to go after Jews and Judaism.
I'm just describing as a student of Soviet ideology. I know what I'm talking about. It started under Stalin. It got enhanced under Nikita Khrushchev. And obviously, anti-Zionism became a fundamental underpinning of the Soviet ideology.
Soon after Lenin died in 1924, Stalin revived the protocols and made it the basis for his anti-Semitic purges. Over 7 million Russians were framed as Zionist spies and executed at Stalin's order. In Germany, Hitler used the protocols to blame the Jews for all of the disasters that had befallen the country. The Nazis translated the protocols into many new languages and flooded the world with them to create the impression of a Jewish conspiracy aimed at world domination, thus justifying the persecution of Jews as a matter of self-defense.
If you read some of the documents of the Nazis and newspapers of the Nazis and so on, you will see that they considered the protocols, Hitler himself considered the protocols to be a historical evidence for their anti-Semitic fantasies.
The use of disinformation to promote anti-Semitism did not, however, end with the defeat of Nazi Germany. In the late 1960s, KGB chief Yuri Andropov gave the protocols a new life in the Middle East.
During the Cold War, disinformation became a national policy. More people in the Soviet bloc worked for the disinformation machinery than for the Soviet army and defense industry put together. The bloc's intelligence community alone had well over 1 million officers and several million informants around the world. All were involved in deceiving the West, as well as their own people.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
President Ronald Reagan shocked people when he called the Soviet Union the evil empire. But it was evil. And the disinformation operation of its KGB and the whole intelligence apparatus was a key part of advancing that evil agenda.
Basically, the Soviet government, it was extremely successful in brainwashing millions and millions of people.
On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland and set the world at war once again. 16 days later, Russia invaded Poland from the east in accordance with a secret protocol in the pact between Stalin and Hitler. This non-aggression agreement also gave Stalin the right to take parts of Romania and other parts of the Baltic. Without warning, on June 22, 1941, Germany terminated the pact and invaded the Soviet Union. Stalin's trust in Hitler cost Russia dearly. He even ignored intelligence warnings that Germany was likely to attack, believing such reports to be disinformation. Within 6 months, the Soviet military had suffered 4.3 million casualties, and Germany had captured 3 million Soviet prisoners. Although it was the most dedicated ally of Germany, Romania eventually turned to the Allied side. On August 23, 1944, just as the Red Army was penetrating the Moldavian front, King Michael led a successful coup to depose the Antonescu dictatorship. This resulted in a split of the country between those that still supported Germany and those that supported the new government.
Many in Romania had been fooled by Hitler, his propaganda, his disinformation. But my father, we could see him for what he was. I learned then to hate dictators. When Romania joined the Allies at the age of 16, I found myself fighting the Germans with a gun in my hands. 4 years of war squeezed Romania like a sponge, and what little remained had been stolen by the Soviet army. Despite the war, I finished high school, and in 1947 was number 3 on the list of students admitted to the Polytechnica University of Bucharest. With the war over, I thought the nightmare had ended. Little did I know what was ahead for me and my country.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The Communist parties, or fifth columns, constitute a growing challenge and peril to Christian civilization.
Churchill's Fulton speech of 1946, which actually finally made America and Britain recognize that there is ideological war, whether they want it or not, and they deliberately accepted this fact and started to fight this war.
Following the war, Russia held the upper hand as the Red Army occupied and held much of Eastern Europe with a military 3 times greater than the Allied forces in the West. Yet, at the Yalta Conference, as part of the Big Three, Stalin agreed that all liberated European and former Axis satellite countries would hold free elections. Soviet Minister Molotov expressed worry that the Yalta Agreement's wording might impede Russia's plans. Stalin responded, "Never mind, we'll do it our own way later." Stalin knew he had another secret disinformation weapon in his arsenal, a tactic called framing. Many believe that the worst damage from Soviet intelligence operations against the West has been the theft of highly classified secrets. In actuality, the worst and often irreparable damage done to the free world has been caused by the Kremlin's disinformation operations, designed to change the past. In KGB jargon, changing people's pasts was called framing, and it was a highly classified disinformation specialty. Both Lenin and Stalin successfully purged millions of rivals, opponents, and uncooperative citizens by framing them as traitors or Zionist spies. In 1945, Stalin decided to use his disinformation machine to take control of Eastern Europe. Nazi sympathizers were considered the most vile people at that time, and to be framed as such meant to be ostracized, arrested, or to be sentenced to death. Stalin used this black art of framing on numerous innocents.
I saw as Romania's heroic King Michael was framed as a Nazi collaborator and Western spy and forced to abdicate. Within just a few years, virtually the entire Romanian economy was running on stolen property. With control of the media, the government launched powerful disinformation offensives to persuade everyone that Romania could be changed into a prosperous country just by confiscating others' wealth.
And Romania was supposed to be an Allied control after 45. Why was that so much free hand given to Stalin? That's my acquisition.
The Sovietization of Eastern Europe was accomplished by the Kremlin through subversive framing operations. All the initial leaders of the Eastern European countries were absolute nobodies, some even criminals, but all swore loyalty to the Kremlin's religion, Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism. The Soviet disinformation machinery thus framed the useful ones as national heroes, and the anti-communists became Nazis.
Huge crowds such as these shown here gather in the square before St. Peter's in Rome, where His Holiness Pope Pius XII speaks to them. This year, 400,000 listened intently to his solemn Easter message. In it, he warned the world that a time of serious crisis is at hand, and gravely cautioned his listeners against red factions who would seize power in Italy and deny Christianity its right to exist.
He despised the notion of communism, and he despised the notion of godless countries. And so he was the enemy, the supreme enemy.
He knew what communism meant, and it brought the church to its knees wherever it was, brought people to their knees.
For Stalin's plan to succeed, he knew he must destroy one of his greatest enemies. The church within those countries was his next target. The war between communism and the Catholic Church is almost as old as communism itself. In Russia, Lenin killed thousands of priests and closed most churches to make Marxism-Leninism the country's sole religion.
Most Americans and most people in the Western world do not understand what communism is about. Communism is first, way before economic system, is a religion. It has a God, his name is Lenin. It has a church, its name is the Communist Party of the USSR. It has its prophets, it has its rituals, it has its texts, it has the Bible, it has everything. Lenin is in you, Lenin is in me, Lenin is everywhere. So just substitute Jesus or God and you'll understand where it comes from. They stole everything from Judaism, actually. So I believed in my God. Lenin was the most important hero, the most important person in my childhood. I was willing to inform on my parents. I was a good patriot. I was willing to die to destroy imperialism in America.
On June 3, 1945, Radio Moscow proclaimed that the leader of the Catholic Church, Pope Pius XII, had been Hitler's pope, insinuating that he had been an ally of the Nazis during World War II. This was the first salvo of a calculated operation designed to smear the reigning pope in the eyes of the world. Radio Moscow's insinuation fell flat as a pancake. Churchill called him the greatest man of our time, and Albert Einstein wrote, "Before I had not been interested in the church, but today I felt a great admiration for the church, which alone has had the courage to stand against the Hitlerian onslaught on liberty." In the 1960s, the Kremlin tried again with a new generation. Central to that framing effort, codenamed Operation Seat 12, was the 1963 theatrical play The Deputy, written by the leftist German playwright Rolf Hackut. It had the KGB's hands all over it, and it proceeded to promote the idea that Pius XII was Hitler's pope.
If you plug in, it's not just a play, but it's the whole Soviet disinformation mechanism behind the play that's promoting the play, doing books about the play, having the play translated and produced, and making kids in high school in the Soviet Union and other satellite nations go see it each year.
This man is in ground zero in Rome, surrounded by hostile forces.
No one seriously doubted where the Pope stood during the war. This all came up afterwards, after the Soviet plot came in, beginning in 1963 with the play The Deputy.
They used the network of the Roman Catholic Church to save Jewish lives.
Every rectory, every convent, every school throughout Rome became a sanctuary for Jews. In Rome, they saved about 8,000 Jews that way, and had one of the highest percentages of anywhere people being saved. There are a lot of testimony from Jewish people who say, you know, I was there, or my relatives were there.
The Concordat that was signed with Germany enabled the church to save converted Jews. He was infiltrated by spies and still managed to save Jewish lives, which were not part of his flock. How the world came to change its opinion of him is outrageous. The Valkyrie attempt on Hitler's life, 1944. We have the documents of the Kaltenbrunner report. It names Pacelli and his secretary Lieber as co-conspirators. Why? Because they were. They actually said that they would not interfere to negotiate a peace unless Hitler was dead.
He was hailed at the liberation of Rome, at the end of the war, at the time of his death in 1958. There are letters that the Holy See was inundated with letters and tributes and thanks and stuff, and everyone, and that's 1958. By 1963, he's a villain. How does that happen? Well, it happens because